To understand this section of the introduction, I have to go back a little bit to the previous section, because the acknowledgement of Balthasar that we cannot throw out the early experiences of the church and how they experienced it that are relative to us today, because within those streams are the mystical, esoteric understanding of the revelation of God in the world as found in the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament. And what happens during the Reformation is that those very things are, in many senses, set aside for the experience of faith itself within the person, often in a very subjective way. That's his criticism that's going to come up in this section. So he says, just previous to the section we'll look at today, he brings up the very books that were rejected in the Protestant Bible, like the Book of Wisdom. In the wisdom books, the Holy Spirit of Scripture reflects on himself, but he takes not only the deeds of the past as the object of his praise, but also the splendor of natural creation, the conditions and attitudes of mortal man, and above all, wisdom herself, who is conscious of praising herself explicitly. The self-contemplation of Sophia is glorious praise, and therefore, in its own way, it is just as prophetic and poetical as God's revelation in history, nature, and human life, which she likewise extols. So we have this embrace of the wisdom books that are often somewhat these mysterious books that didn't make their way into the Protestant Bibles. And so what does that mean for Balthasar's criticism of the and criticism's not in a negative light, it's just a factual criticism, a critique of what happens with the Protestant theology, which starts to lack some of the original beauty. It's because he says the very thing they shouldn't do and that we shouldn't do is what they do. So in the last few sentences before section 3 starts, he talks about biblical gnosis. Biblical gnosis, which is steeped in the same diffuse atmosphere of late antiquity as our Philo, the early Gnostic mystery texts, Hermetic literature, and the beginnings of what eventually produced Alexandrian Christianity. To excise all this from scriptural revelation would mean abandoning the historical setting of the biblical revelation and would leave only a certain moralism, which was non-historical and therefore, however existential, ultimately ineffective. And then the very next sentence in the next section that we'll look at today, the Elimination of Aesthetics from Theology, Protestant version, he says, and yet from the very start, the Protestant Reformation embarked on just such an operation, which it has pursued ever since. And then we jump into looking at Luther. I came across Balthasar because I came from an esoteric path of studying Rudolf Steiner, and then I came across Valentin Tomberg, who wrote a wonderful book considered a Hermetic book of the Hermetic mystical tradition in relation to Catholicism, as he was a converted Catholic and left the esoteric tradition, but didn't leave the value of esotericism behind. So I came across Balthasar writes, sometimes in some editions it's the foreword, in some editions it's the afterword, but I came across Balthasar when I read Valentin Tomberg's favorite work, Meditations on the Tarot, which is actually about Christian Hermeticism. What Balthasar is saying here is if we discount this aspect of the experience of God's revelation on earth, what we often call mystical, hermetic, esoteric, and we know his relation with Adrian von Sperr, who would be considered a mystic herself, that then we lose this life, this poetical, this aspect of revelation and biblical gnosis, as he calls it, that will leave us with possibly something very dry and lacking the overwhelming beauty that such experiences and knowledge, and that God himself actually possesses, that then through those experiences we align ourselves with that to some degree or other. So what is Balthasar bringing out that occurs during the Reformation and the Protestant view on God? We go from, and he won't hold these criticisms back from the Catholic Church either. There was definitely, we all know, during the Reformation times, there was definitely many things within the church that needed much correcting and was open to much criticism. And Balthasar will not hold these criticisms back from directed at the church, the Catholic Church itself, but he's just simply trying to show how all these various streams in their relationship to his desire to bring the beautiful back into theology. What we have before Luther and the Reformation is, we could say in a sense, a broader, wider, holistic approach that was taking into account the history of man up until then. So the early church fathers were drawing from Neoplatonic sources, philosophical sources, and they then used that to explain the revelation of the Christian God, Jesus Christ, on earth. Luther and any who then start to narrow the scope of the revelation will then very possibly start to take out parts of the whole, and then we lose that original connection we have to the whole. So Luther really zeroes in on justification and the experience of faith. And once that occurs, you're going from this wide, broad picture of the true, the good, the beautiful, and you're bringing it down into your personal experience. And it's not that there isn't universal validity in the personal experience of feeling the reality of the justification and the experience of your faith. That's a huge source of inspiration behind what we commonly call evangelical Christianity. It's that experience of once I was lost, but now I'm found, and that conversion of the soul. But then also by drawing it down very closely and intimately related to that experience that we have within ourselves, the subjective aspect, we then very possibly lose sight of the larger objective aspect of the revelation of Jesus Christ on earth. The vast mysteries of reality, the true, the good, the beautiful, that forms the foundation of being itself, but then also how we will do theology in relation to that being, those realities, it takes a lot of thinking in the most mystical, esoteric ways to grasp those truths. Yet the experience of having the moment of conversion and being justified and being saved, that's experienced by people. So it's something they can really grab onto, really understand that, once I was this way, then this grace came into my life, and now I'm this other way. Before the Reformation, the Catholic Church, as the largest institution of Christianity, had the stronghold on people's their way of experiencing the faith, and building up the large institution around it, and getting things in place that could be looked at as non-essential to the conversion experience and or the experience of Christianity itself. As we know, as Bibles got translated into the vernacular, people had a direct avenue towards seeing what the Bible says, and they were able, in their own subjective level, individual level, subjective not a bad word, but just on their own individual level, to see things that didn't seem to correspond to what the church taught, and or all the extra add-ons that the Catholic Church seemed to have. So we all know the story of the Reformation and what was attacked and what was torn away from it. Balthasar's premise here is not going to be an attack against Protestantism itself, because actually he's attacked sometimes for being too cozy to Protestantism and alternative ways of expressing faith. But it's within the nature of drawing these great concepts and this way of thinking about reality, the true, the good, the beautiful, God, the revelation of Jesus Christ, bringing it down to a more individual level. Balthasar is simply trying to point out what are the limitations going to be to that, and how can we recover these once great ideas and concepts to not lose the truth, the good, the beautiful in how we express and do our theology over these things. Now, many people, other than those that have the ability, desire, gift to do theology, really don't have to worry about these things, because any person, as we see in our Protestant brothers and sisters and evangelical people, the experience of the faith, of having the moment where they come into faith, that is the overriding powerful experience in their life. But there is some that we have to keep this tradition alive to make even greater sense of where that fits into the larger puzzle. Because if we're going to speak of God and these realities, then we are speaking of the very nature of reality, the very nature of being itself. Theology and its relationship to what we would call philosophical activity, as we've discussed earlier, are very close in that sense. But theology then takes into account the Christ revelation, Jesus Christ, the incarnation, the Trinity coming onto earth for us. Remember that the beautiful is self-evident. It's the lightning flash. When we spiral out into that which may not be beautiful or perfectly and directly related to that, we're then very possibly dealing in subjectivisms that then can be manipulated and off course. And we can never take away that everyone who professes Christ is a sinner and is working hard on their salvation. But Balthasar is asking the question with his theology that's deeply grounded in the Catholic tradition. What happens when we lose that connection, including when Catholicism loses that connection? We have to look at these ramifications, and then we can make sense of how we lost the source. The movement that's been described that Balthasar is part of is this ressourcement movement, where getting back to these foundations that we spoke of earlier in this video that really formed the foundation of the Christian believing. Because when Balthasar did a survey of where theology was going and it is going, and he had in the modern times here, writing in the mid 1900s, he for the first time had some freedom and flexibility to view things in a way that up until then weren't possible. He had some freedoms to think about these things in this way, and to see where the long streams of the theological revelations were kind of going off in a way that are either dead ends or, as he said, open to manipulation, because they're no longer really connected to the very ground of being. In earlier times, there was less separation between what we call the religious and the secular. And so the beautiful been always more attached to the ultimate reality of things, God. But then now in our modern times, as we start the Protestant theology that starts to detach these original ideas of truth, goodness, and beauty from God and from the deepest ground of being, then the aesthetic, which is the study of the beautiful, can then be taken from the theological and used towards worldly purposes. Hence my very dramatic intro video. That was a little overly dramatic, but showing a point that Balthasar points out, that now we're in an age in which, for the first time in intellectual history, aesthetics, now sharply distinguished from both logic and ethics, was given a particular value of its own. This process of insulating the aesthetic from logic and ethics, as opposed to its total integration within the one, the true, and the good in the Greeks and in earlier theology, must always be kept in mind if we are to understand rightly the banishment of the aesthetic from the realm of theology by Kierkegaard, and the more recent Catholic and Protestant theology, which is dependent on him. So once we have this separation, and we can, because the Catholic view of things was not able to hold all things together, and through its own internal issues and various aspects that allowed it to be open to criticism and allow a shift in thinking, we now separate the aesthetic, the good, the beautiful, from that original source where it actually must always be found and it will always be there, because God must be beautiful. God must be true. God must be good. But if we go off on another path, we can start using those terms for things not worthy of our adoration to the degree that the good, the true, the beautiful truly deserves. So let's just talk about this at a more basic level that kind of exposes to the degree that the beautiful is dangerous in a sense to bring into theology because of beauty being so often in the world can be considered a temptation or lead us astray. This isn't just about beauty of persons. This is beauty of anything and all in the world that participates in the beautiful. These are always sometimes the things that draw us most intensely. But if we're not then able to appropriately handle beauty in all its different forms, then our theology can quickly become dry, ugly, and lifeless. And so I can't go into all the details of Balthasar's what he explains about Barth here. Barth, a great Protestant theologian that starts to bring the beautiful back in, but I'll just read a quote here from this section of what Barth is, why Barth realizes too that he has to bring the beautiful back into theology intimately because of what the result is of not having it there. He says, much too much would have to be deleted, which in the Bible is clearly and loudly proclaimed, if we were to attempt to deny the legitimacy of the concept of beauty because of some ultra-puritanical earnestness concerning sin. And if the very form of his glory, which mere thought can never simply banish, consists not only in awe, thankfulness, admiration, and submission, but also in joy, pleasure, and delight in God and in his splendor. If the form of his glory is determined precisely by his ability to transport us to joy, and further determined by that joyous rapture itself, how could we then possibly dispense with the concept of the beautiful? So this is where we have to be very discerning and be strong in our faith to know our relationship to the beautiful, because being one of the highest and greatest aspects of reality, imitations of the beautiful can easily lead us astray into the world. The prince of this world knows how much we are drawn to beauty. There's no way that we are not drawn to beauty. It is the nature of reality that the most beautiful is what will draw us along to the greatest degree. But to understand where and what and how to relate to what is beautiful and how that which is beautiful relates to the larger picture of God, the Trinity, truth, goodness, and beauty, that's the challenge. We've seen much Christianity and theology be a little too loose with the beautiful, because as Barth says, if we seek Christ's beauty in a glory which is not that of the crucified, we are doomed to seek in vain. We must look through the crucifixion to truly understand the beautiful, because on the pre-Easter, before our definition of beauty, before the crucifixion, without the crucifixion, is going to be much different than if we really zero in and focus on the crucifixion. That's going to change our relationship to beauty. That's going to bring us a higher perspective, a more clear perspective, because not only is beautiful things beautiful, but sacrifice can be beautiful. Denial can be beautiful. Ways in which we participate in reality, in the world, that are seemingly beautiful can be absolutely ugly and sinful and lead us to places. You could just take a simple example of drugs. There might be a temporary feeling of the good. You might feel good. You might see beautiful things. But that way of seeking is not a sustainable or healthy or godly way to find those feelings. So we must view the beautiful through the lenses of the crucified. Then that brings us back to this better, deeper understanding of God, of reality, the Trinity. The Son is God. He is crucified. He has to go through that to make us more deeply understand what it means to be human. And in our mistakes and our failings of doing that, that's why the crucifixion is a place where we can heal our wounds and our mistakes and our sinfulness, because we often fall short of these understandings. But I hope in exploring these ideas of our relation to the true, the good, the beautiful, that we get a better understanding and a better feel for what truly is. Because so many of us are going wrong paths or go down paths that are dead ends that seem to be right. And that's where the prince of this world is always tempting us. And that's good. That's good in a way, because it's in denying ourselves those temptations, learning from those temptations, to have the wisdom to stand back from those temptations, that God perfects us. And then we can really grab a deeper grip of what God is, what reality can be, what it should be, when what truly is beautiful.